Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1843, when the Spanish moss hung particularly heavy from the live oaks of Savannah, a series of dinner parties, hosted by the widow Abigail Thornwood, became the subject of hushed conversations throughout the city's elite circles. What began as elegant social gatherings at her mansion on Abercorn Street would eventually unveil one of the most disturbing cases of psychological torment ever documented in antebellum Georgia. The events that transpired within those brick walls would leave an indelible mark on Savannah society, a wound that even time could not fully heal. The Thornwood estate stood 3 stories tall at the edge of Forsyth Park, its white columns gleaming against red brick, a monument to the family's cotton fortune. From the outside, the house appeared to be a perfect example of Southern prosperity. The wrought iron gate, the carefully maintained garden with its central fountain, everything spoke of wealth and refinement. Yet those who entered the widow's home after her husband's passing in early 1843 often remarked on the strange atmosphere that seemed to permeate the place. The house felt colder than it should have, even in the warmest months. Guests reported hearing odd creaking sounds from the servants' quarters behind the main house, sounds that couldn't be explained by the settling of an old building or the coastal winds. Some spoke of catching glimpses of movement in mirrors or darkened hallways, only to find empty spaces when they turned to look directly. According to documents preserved in the Savannah Historical Society archives, discovered during a cataloging project in 1952, Abigail Thornwood had arrived in Savannah from Boston in 1838 as the young bride of Jonathan Thornwood, a man nearly 30 years her senior. Their marriage had been arranged through family connections, bringing together Jonathan's wealth and Abigail's social standing from a formerly prosperous Massachusetts family. The Thornwood name had been established in Savannah since the late 1700s, with Jonathan's grandfather having been among the first to establish successful cotton operations after the Revolutionary War. Those who knew the couple described their relationship as cordial but distant. Jonathan spent most of his time managing his plantation outside the city, while Abigail quickly established herself in Savannah society. She was known for her intelligence and unusual education for a woman of that era. Several accounts mention her facility with languages and her extensive reading habits. The library at the Thornwood mansion was said to contain volumes in French, German, and even Greek, many of which appeared to have been well used by the lady of the house. A letter from Jonathan's sister Elizabeth to her daughter in Charleston, dated November 1841, offers perhaps the most intimate glimpse into the Thornwood marriage. My brother seems content with his young wife, though I sense no great passion between them. She manages his household with admirable efficiency, and he provides her with the means to pursue her peculiar interests. They orbit one another like distant planets, connected by unseen forces, but never truly touching. When Jonathan died of what was recorded as complications of the heart in February of 1843, Abigail donned the black crape of mourning and retreated from social life for precisely 6 weeks, the minimum period deemed acceptable before gradually returning to society. Several journal entries from prominent Savannah women noted how the widow's grief seemed remarkably controlled. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington wrote in her personal diary, dated March 30th, 1843, "Mrs. T. receives visitors with such composure one might think she had misplaced a handkerchief rather than buried a husband. Her eyes remain dry while her lips form perfect expressions of gratitude for our condolences." An entry in the diary of Reverend James Stillwell of Christ Church, who had performed Jonathan's funeral service, offers a similar observation. The widow Thornwood maintains a dignity in grief that borders on the unnatural. When I spoke with her after the service about the comfort of faith in times of loss, she regarded me with an expression I found difficult to interpret, neither sorrow nor anger, but something akin to curiosity, as if my words were specimens she was examining rather than solace she was receiving. By April, the widow had begun hosting small gatherings again. These started as afternoon teas, but soon evolved into elaborate dinner parties that became highly coveted invitations among Savannah's elite. What made these dinners particularly noteworthy was Abigail's reputation as an extraordinary hostess who served the most remarkable and exotic dishes, unusual fare that no other household in Savannah could replicate. The food was described as having flavors unknown to the region and textures that defied explanation. Guests would leave her table unable to identify precisely what they had consumed, but invariably impressed by the unique culinary experience. Dr. Thomas Blackwood, a prominent physician and regular guest at these gatherings, wrote in a letter to a medical colleague in Charleston, "The widow's table offers sensations that defy conventional culinary understanding. Last evening we were served what appeared to be a simple terrine, yet the flavors evolved as one consumed it, beginning with something reminiscent of game, then shifting toward notes one might associate with aged spirits, before concluding with an almost floral sweetness." When questioned about her methods, Mrs. Thornwood merely smiles and attributes her success to old family recipes reinterpreted through modern understanding. It was during this period that Abigail acquired a new house servant named Solomon. Very little is known about Solomon's origins. The bill of sale, discovered decades later in a hidden compartment of Abigail's writing desk, indicates only that he was purchased from a trader operating out of Charleston for a sum considerably above the standard market rate. The document describes him as 35 years of age, literate, experienced in household management, and the preparation of medicinal compounds. This last qualification was unusual enough to have been noted by the clerk who recorded the transaction, adding a marginal note. Buyer specifically requested knowledge of preparations and preservations. Unlike the other servants in the Thornwood household who had been there for years, Solomon was kept separate, assigned to duties that required minimal interaction with others. Household accounts indicate he was given quarters in the cellar rather than in the servant buildings behind the main house. This arrangement, while unusual, was explained away as necessary due to Solomon's role as both household servant and personal assistant to the widow in her various intellectual pursuits. According to testimony later collected by the Savannah Constabulary, Solomon was described by other household servants as uncommonly quiet and possessed of a knowledge that made the others uneasy. Mary Jenkins, who served as a kitchen maid in the Thornwood house, stated, "He never spoke more than necessary, but his eyes seemed to hold secrets. The mistress would summon him alone to her study late in the evenings. We could hear their voices, though never the words. Sometimes they would speak in a language none of us recognized, not French or Spanish or any tongue I've heard in the port." Another servant, James Wilson, who worked as a footman, reported that Solomon often returned from the market with parcels that went directly to the cellar rather than the kitchen. He would come back with bundles wrapped in oilcloth, careful-like, and take them below stairs. The mistress had a room down there none of us were permitted to enter, a pantry, she called it, though no food for the household ever came from it. The dinner parties continued through the summer of 1843, growing more elaborate with each passing month. Abigail began incorporating unusual rituals into these gatherings. Guests were required to wear specific colors designated in their invitations. The dining room would be arranged differently for each event, with tables, sometimes placed at odd angles, that forced diners to sit with their backs to certain doors or windows. Most peculiar was Abigail's insistence that before each meal, guests participate in a moment of silence while holding hands, ostensibly to honor the memory of her late husband, though some noted she never actually mentioned Jonathan during these ceremonies. Frederick Marshall, a merchant who attended several of these dinners, wrote to his brother in Atlanta, The widow's gatherings have taken on an almost ritualistic quality. Last night, we were instructed to pass each dish clockwise around the table, never counterclockwise, and to consume at least a portion of everything offered regardless of appetite or preference. When young Mrs. Wilkes attempted to decline a particularly unusual aspic, claiming digestive sensitivity, our hostess fixed her with such a penetrating stare that the poor woman not only accepted the dish, but cleaned her plate entirely. By September, rumors began circulating about strange occurrences at the Thornwood mansion. A manservant employed by the neighboring Patterson family reported seeing lights moving in the cellar windows at unusual hours. The local apothecary noted that Abigail had placed orders for uncommon herbs and substances, wormwood, belladonna, and various minerals used in embalming. Though none of these purchases were illegal or entirely unusual for someone who might be treating various ailments, the combination raised quiet concerns. Sarah Collins, who operated a small herb shop near the market, provided a statement in 1845 during the subsequent investigation. The widow would come in regular, always very specific about what she wanted. Not just common herbs, mind you, but things most ladies wouldn't know by name. She asked for hellebore and mandrake root, cinnabar powder, and oil of cubeb. When I hadn't what she sought, she never seemed disappointed, just nodded as if confirming something, and moved on to her next request. Once she asked if I could obtain fresh adder's tongue, and when I said such a thing wasn't to be had in Savannah, she smiled in a way that made my skin prickle and said, "Of course not. Some ingredients must be harvested personally." On September 23, 1843, Abigail hosted what would become her most infamous dinner party. The guest list included Judge William Harrington and his wife Eleanor, Dr. Thomas Blackwood and his wife Catherine, Reverend James Stillwell of Christ Church, prominent merchant Frederick Marshall and his wife Sophia, and the recently widowed Mrs. Constance Palmer. These individuals represented the most influential circles in Savannah society: legal, medical, religious, commercial, and social. Printed on heavy cream paper with a border of black vines, it specified that guests should arrive precisely at 8 o'clock and wear colors of the evening sky. A postscript, handwritten in what would later be confirmed as Abigail's elegant script, added, "Come with empty stomachs and open minds, for tonight we shall transcend the ordinary boundaries of experience." According to Eleanor Harrington's diary, the house was illuminated by an unusual number of candles that night, with every chandelier and wall sconce lit despite the warm September evening. The invitation, preserved in the Savannah Historical Society collection, was unusual even by Abigail's standards. The air was heavy with the scent of unfamiliar incense, which Abigail attributed to a gift from an Oriental merchant who had recently visited the port. Several guests noted that the usual paintings in the foyer and drawing room had been replaced with unusual artwork, detailed anatomical drawings that Abigail described as studies from my late husband's medical collection. The dinner began with a strange toast offered by their hostess. As recorded in Reverend Stillwell's journal, Abigail raised her glass and said, "To those who nourish us in life and sustain us in death." The guests, though finding the toast somewhat morbid, politely participated. What followed was a 7-course meal that guests later described as extraordinary and unlike anything previously experienced. Each dish featured unusual combinations, sweet elements in savory courses, textures that seemed to change as they were consumed, flavors that could not be identified. Dr. Blackwood's account mentioned a soup that began cool on the palate despite being served steaming hot, then seemed to warm the throat and chest long after it had been swallowed. Sophia Marshall, in a letter to her sister, described a fish course that possessed a firmness unlike any seafood I have encountered, with a flavor that somehow reminded me of autumn leaves and distant smoke. Though how food might taste of such things, I cannot explain. The centerpiece of the meal was what? Abigail called heritage pâté, served on small pieces of dark wood rather than plates. When Dr. Blackwood inquired about the unusual serving method, Abigail explained that the wood came from a vessel that had carried precious cargo. The pâté itself was described as having an earthy quality that several guests found difficult to place, but nonetheless consumed out of politeness. Eleanor Harrington's diary entry about this particular course is telling. The substance before us resembled no pâté I have ever seen, darker, with a consistency that seemed almost to resist the knife before yielding. I found myself hesitant to taste it, though I could not articulate why. When I finally took a small portion, the flavor was initially bitter, then developed a peculiar sweetness that lingered uncomfortably. Throughout the experience, our hostess watched us with an intensity I found unsettling, her eyes moving from face to face as if recording our reactions for some future reference. After the meal, rather than retiring to separate rooms, as was customary, gentlemen to the study for brandy and cigars, ladies to the parlor for tea, Abigail insisted that everyone remain together. She then proposed an unusual entertainment. Each guest would share a secret they had never before revealed. When Reverend Stillwell objected to such an intimate game, Abigail laughed in a manner that several guests later described as unsettling, and suggested instead that she would share a story about the meal they had just enjoyed. What followed has been pieced together from the separate accounts of the guests, each recorded in various forms: letters, diary entries, and later official statements. Abigail reportedly stood at the head of the table and began to speak in a voice that Mrs. Palmer described as hollow, as if coming from a great distance. "You have all wondered about the unique flavors of my table," Abigail began. "Tonight I shall reveal my secret." She then rang a small silver bell, summoning Solomon from the servants' quarters. He entered carrying what appeared to be a wooden box approximately 3 feet in length. At Abigail's instruction, he placed this on a sideboard and removed the lid. Several guests later reported that they initially thought the box contained unusual serving implements or perhaps exotic ingredients. The actual contents were obscured from most by the angle of the sideboard. Only Judge Harrington, seated closest to that end of the room, had a clear view. His wife's diary entry states that he suddenly pushed back from the table, his face draining of color. "William looked as though he had seen something impossible," Eleanor wrote. "He began to rise from his chair when Mrs. Thornwood placed her hand on his shoulder with such firmness that he winced. I had never before seen my husband, a man who has sentenced others to death without flinching, appear genuinely frightened." According to Dr. Blackwood's account, written as part of his medical journal, Abigail then addressed the judge directly. "You recognize the craftsmanship, perhaps? It is, after all, from your own workshop." The Harrington family owned a furniture and cabinetry business that, among other items, produced coffins for many of Savannah's deceased. It was at this point that Abigail allegedly revealed the nature of the box. A coffin, specifically a small one designed for transporting remains. Such containers were sometimes used when a body needed to be moved from place to place before final burial. In this particular case, she claimed the coffin contained the partial remains of Solomon's predecessor, a man known only as Emmanuel. Reverend Stillwell's account provides the most detailed description of what followed. According to his private journal found decades later among his personal effects, Abigail proceeded to explain that Emmanuel had not, as the household believed, been sold to a plantation in South Carolina. Instead, she claimed he had died under circumstances she did not specify, and she had preserved portions of his body through a process she had learned from ancient texts discovered in her late husband's library. The widow spoke with a detached precision, Stillwell wrote, as if describing nothing more significant than a recipe for preserving fruit. She explained that the wooden platters on which our final course was served had been cut from Emmanuel's coffin lid, and that the pâté itself contained elements that had once been part of the man. She spoke of a tradition from distant lands, whereby consuming a portion of another transfers their essence to the consumer. "We have all this evening partaken of Emmanuel," she said, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight, "and in doing so we have ensured that a part of him will never truly perish." At this revelation, chaos erupted at the table. Mrs. Palmer fainted. Sophia Marshall became violently ill. Dr. Blackwood demanded to examine the contents of the box, while Reverend Stillwell began reciting prayers. Judge Harrington attempted to restrain Abigail, believing her to have lost her mind. It was at this point that Solomon intervened. According to multiple accounts, he stepped between the judge and Abigail with unexpected authority. "The mistress speaks in metaphors," he reportedly said, his voice calm but commanding. "The box contains only herbs and spices from the islands. It is an old custom to store such things in wood that has been blessed." This explanation, delivered with such conviction, momentarily calmed the situation. Abigail's subsequent behavior added to the confusion. She laughed brightly, as if the entire scene had been an elaborate jest, and chided her guests for their gullibility. "How extraordinary that you would believe such a tale," she reportedly said. "I had hoped to demonstrate how easily fear can overcome reason, even in the most educated minds. The pâté is nothing more exotic than a preparation of liver and truffles, served on olive wood platters, though I confess the story of their origin is far less dramatic than the tale I spun for your entertainment." The guests, unsettled but uncertain what to believe, soon made their excuses and departed. Each would later report being followed by the sensation of being watched as they made their way home through Savannah's squares. Several mentioned experiencing unusual dreams that night, in which they found themselves seated at a table much longer than Abigail's, surrounded by silent figures they could not quite see. Frederick Marshall wrote to his brother the following day, "I cannot shake the feeling that something fundamental has been altered by last night's experience. I awoke several times from dreams in which I was both consumer and consumed, my identity blurring with others in a manner most disturbing. Sophia remains unwell, complaining of a taste she cannot rid herself of, regardless of what she drinks." The following morning, Judge Harrington returned to the Thornwood mansion with a constable, insisting on examining the wooden box from the previous evening. They found the house in perfect order, with no sign of the box. Abigail received them with apparent confusion, denying any knowledge of a coffin or unusual dinner service. Solomon, when questioned separately, maintained that the previous night's events had been nothing more than a storytelling game proposed by his mistress to entertain her guests. The constable's report, filed later that day, noted, "The premises were searched with Mrs. Thornwood's permission, revealing nothing of a suspicious nature. The cellar contains a room Mrs. T. uses as a pantry for imported foodstuffs, locked but opened at our request, containing nothing beyond jars of preserved goods and bottles of wine. If there was a coffin or similar container present the previous evening, it has been removed or concealed beyond our ability to discover." Without evidence of wrongdoing, and faced with the inconsistency between the guests' accounts and the calm denials of the household, the constable could take no action. Judge Harrington, however, was not satisfied. He began a quiet investigation, reviewing records from his family's workshop and interviewing staff about recent commissions. What he discovered raised more questions than it answered. The workshop had indeed produced a small transportation coffin in February 1843, coinciding with Jonathan Thornwood's death. According to the workshop records, this had been an additional order, separate from the full-sized burial coffin used for Jonathan's funeral. The stated purpose was for transporting personal effects to relatives in Massachusetts, yet there was no record of such a shipment ever leaving Savannah. Further investigation revealed that Emmanuel's disappearance from the Thornwood household had occurred just 2 days before Jonathan's death. The official record indicated he had been sold, but Judge Harrington could find no documentation confirming such a transaction. A discreet inquiry to contacts in Charleston yielded no record of Emmanuel having been purchased or registered there. Most disturbing was what the judge discovered when he spoke with the cemetery caretaker who had overseen Jonathan Thornwood's burial. The man, initially reluctant to speak, eventually admitted that something unusual had occurred. The widow insisted on a private moment before the coffin was sealed, he told Harrington. She dismissed even the funeral director, remaining alone with her husband's body for nearly half an hour. When she emerged, her demeanor had changed entirely. The grief seemed to have lifted. She gave instructions that the coffin was to be sealed immediately and not reopened under any circumstances. As October progressed, a pattern emerged among those who had attended the infamous dinner party. Each began to experience unusual symptoms: persistent digestive discomfort, disturbing dreams, and a pervasive sense of being observed. Dr. Blackwood, attempting to treat his own symptoms and those of the others, noted similarities to certain forms of slow poisoning, though he could not identify a specific agent. In his medical journal, he wrote, "The symptoms defy conventional categorization. There is a wasting quality to the affliction, but it manifests inconsistently across patients." Frederick reports intense hunger that cannot be satisfied, while his wife experiences revulsion at the mere thought of food. Constance suffers from episodes of vertigo and disorientation, particularly at dusk. The Reverend describes a sensation of something moving beneath the skin, though examination reveals no physical abnormality. Common to all is a persistent metallic taste and dreams of unusual vividness featuring themes of consumption and transformation. By the third week of October, Reverend Stillwell had taken to his bed with what he described as a wasting illness of both body and spirit. In his final journal entry, dated October 23rd, he wrote, "I cannot escape the conviction that what passed my lips that night was unholy. I taste it still, awakening with the flavor in my mouth and the certainty that something watches from the corners of my room. Today, as Mrs. Allen read to me from Psalms, I found myself unable to focus on the words of Scripture. Instead, my mind wandered to considerations of what flesh might taste like if prepared with sage and thyme. Such thoughts are surely the product of fever, yet they come with a clarity that terrifies me." The Reverend died on October 25th. The official cause was listed as brain fever, but Dr. Blackwood's private notes expressed doubt. "The decline was too rapid," he wrote, "and accompanied by symptoms I cannot attribute to any known malady." His lucidity remained even as his body failed, and he spoke often of feeling consumed from within. Hours before death, he claimed to see Emmanuel standing at the foot of his bed, missing portions of himself, yet somehow more substantial than the living who attended him. The Reverend's death caused considerable distress in Savannah society, particularly among those who had attended Abigail's dinner party. Frederick Marshall insisted on having his home blessed by another minister, while his wife took to carrying a small Bible with her at all times. Constance Palmer withdrew from social engagements entirely, refusing to dine in company and subsisting, according to her maid, on nothing but weak tea and dry toast. Within a month, both Sophia Marshall and Constance Palmer had also died, each after experiencing similar symptoms. The city began to whisper of a contagion or curse associated with the Thornwood household. Abigail, for her part, appeared untouched by the tragedies. She continued to make social appearances, though her dinner parties ceased. Those who encountered her described an unusual vibrancy about her, as if she had somehow grown younger while those around her declined. Catherine Blackwood, in a letter to her sister in Virginia, wrote, "The widow Thornwood attended the Palmer funeral yesterday, and I was struck by how well she looked, her complexion clear, her eyes bright, her step light, despite the somber occasion. While the rest of us have been marked by these recent tragedies, she appears to be thriving. When she offered her condolences, there was something in her expression that I can only describe as satisfaction, though perhaps grief has made me uncharitable in my assessments." On November 15th, Judge Harrington made one final visit to the Thornwood mansion. No record exists of what transpired during this meeting, as the judge never spoke of it afterward. What is known is that he returned home in a state of extreme agitation and immediately began writing what his wife described as a document of great importance. He instructed her that this document was to be sealed and placed in the care of his law partner, to be opened only in the event of his death. Eleanor later recalled, "William worked through the night, his pen moving without pause. When I inquired about his meeting with Mrs. Thornwood, he would say, only that he had seen enough. He refused food and drink, claiming he no longer trusted what might be in them. By morning the document was complete, some 20 pages, which he sealed himself with wax before summoning his partner to entrust it to him. The last coherent thing he said to me was, 'If I am right, you must leave Savannah. Do not delay, do not make arrangements, simply go.'" The judge died in his sleep that night. Eleanor, distraught but determined to honor her husband's wishes, delivered the sealed document as instructed. Within days, she too had fallen ill, but before her condition became critical, she took an unusual step. She fled Savannah, traveling north to her sister's home in Philadelphia. In correspondence discovered decades later, she explained her departure. "I cannot remain in proximity to that house or its mistress. William discovered something there that he believed would destroy him, and I am convinced it has. I feel it reaching for me as well, a connection forged that night at her table, a bond that draws my strength away even across the distance that separates us. Only by putting many miles between myself and Savannah do I find any relief from the symptoms that claim the others." By removing herself from Savannah, Eleanor Harrington became the only surviving guest from the September dinner party. She never returned to Georgia and lived to the age of 82, though acquaintances noted she refused to discuss her time in Savannah and would leave any room in which the city was mentioned. Her diary, which had been so detailed about the events surrounding the dinner party, contains a curious gap after her departure from Savannah, resuming only months later, with no reference to the events she had fled. In December 1843, Dr. Blackwood became the final casualty among the dinner guests. His medical colleagues were baffled by his symptoms, which included progressive weakness, hallucinations, and what one physician described as an unprecedented discoloration of the tissues. Before his death, he managed to preserve samples of his own blood and tissue with instructions that they be sent to medical researchers in Philadelphia for analysis. His final entry in his medical journal, written in an increasingly unsteady hand, reads, "I am convinced that what ails us is not a natural malady, but something introduced deliberately by our hostess that night. The substance we consumed has established a connection that transcends physical proximity, a sympathetic bond through which something is being drawn from us. I feel my very essence diminishing daily, while reports indicate that she grows more vital. If there is any mercy, my death will sever this connection before she can take all that I am." The results of the analysis of Blackwood's samples, documented in a letter dated March 1844, indicated the presence of several unusual substances, including trace amounts of compounds typically used in embalming. The Philadelphia doctor who conducted the tests concluded that Dr. Blackwood had been exposed to a sophisticated combination of toxins administered over time, suggesting deliberate poisoning rather than accidental exposure. He noted particularly the presence of alkaloids associated with certain fungi and plants known for their psychoactive properties, as well as metallic compounds that had no medical purpose but were sometimes used in preservative processes. This evidence might have been enough to prompt an official investigation into Abigail Thornwood, but the letter never reached Savannah. It was intercepted en route, only to be discovered in 1867 among the personal effects of Solomon, who by then had disappeared from recorded history. The circumstances of this interception remain unknown, though the letter showed signs of having been opened and resealed before being hidden away. As for Abigail Thornwood, she continued to reside in the mansion on Abercorn Street until March 1844, when she abruptly announced her intention to return to Boston. The house was sold, her possessions packed, and arrangements made for travel. Yet there is no record of her arrival in Massachusetts, or indeed any documented sighting of her after she boarded a northbound vessel on March 17th. The captain of the vessel, the Meridian, later reported that Mrs. Thornwood had kept to her cabin for much of the journey, taking meals privately and emerging only for brief periods on deck, always heavily veiled. When the ship docked in New York, she was not among the passengers who disembarked. A subsequent search of her cabin revealed it to be empty, with no sign of her luggage or any personal effects. How she might have left the ship without being observed remained a mystery that the captain could not explain to the satisfaction of authorities who later questioned him. The Thornwood mansion remained vacant for nearly 2 years as rumors about its former occupant discouraged potential buyers. When it was finally purchased in 1846 by the Henderson family, they immediately undertook extensive renovations. During this process, workers discovered a hidden space in the cellar, a room approximately 8 feet square with walls lined in copper. The space contained a table, various implements of unknown purpose, and a collection of small wooden boxes similar to the one described by the dinner guests. William Henderson, in a letter to his brother dated September 1846, described the discovery. The workmen came upon it quite by accident, having noticed a discrepancy between the external dimensions of the cellar and the internal layout. What they found was most disturbing: a chamber concealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall, accessible only through a cleverly disguised panel that pivoted when a particular stone in the adjacent wall was pressed. The room itself defies rational explanation. Its copper lining suggests some scientific purpose, yet the implements found within resemble nothing used in any laboratory I am familiar with. There were knives of unusual design, glass vessels connected by copper tubing, and a table with restraints that I hesitate to contemplate the purpose of. Most disturbing was a ledger found concealed behind a loose copper panel. This document, written in what handwriting experts later confirmed to be Abigail's script, contained detailed notes on what appeared to be experiments in preservation and consumption. The entries included observations on the effects of various preparations on unidentified subjects, with clinical descriptions of symptoms matching those experienced by the dinner guests. One entry, dated February 15, 1843, just days after Jonathan Thornwood's death, read, "The initial attempt proved only partially successful. The subject expired before the full transfer could be completed. The flaw appears to be in the preparation method rather than the theory itself. The essence must be consumed fresh, not preserved, to maintain its potency. Subject E will provide the opportunity to test this hypothesis." Another entry from September 1843 noted, "The collective experiment exceeds expectations. By distributing the essence among multiple recipients and establishing the sympathetic bond through revelation and acknowledgement, the transfer becomes sustainable rather than immediate. I can draw from each according to need, their vitality flowing gradually rather than in a single consuming moment." S expresses concern about the extended process, but cannot deny the results. "My strength increases as theirs wanes." The final entry, dated March 15, 1844, 2 days before Abigail's departure from Savannah, read simply, "The process is complete. What was separate is now unified. I carry them with me always." The Henderson family, upon discovering these items, immediately contacted authorities. A subsequent investigation attempted to locate Abigail Thornwood, but no trace could be found. The ship on which she had departed Savannah arrived in New York with no record of her disembarkation. The captain, when questioned, had no recollection of such a passenger, despite her name appearing on the manifest. This peculiar memory lapse extended to other crew members as well. The steward assigned to her cabin recalled preparing meals for the passenger, but could not describe her appearance or any interaction they might have had. The only concrete detail anyone associated with the voyage could provide was from a young cabin boy who mentioned a lady in black who smelled of herbs and copper. The sealed document left by Judge Harrington was finally opened as part of this investigation. Its contents provided the most disturbing perspective yet on the events of 1843. According to the judge's account, what he saw in the wooden box that night was not merely herbs or preserved remains, but evidence of a practice far more sinister than simple poisoning. Harrington wrote that during his final confrontation with Abigail, she revealed her true purpose. She claimed to have discovered in her husband's library texts describing ancient rituals for absorbing the essence of others through a process involving consumption. The practice, she believed, would transfer the strength, knowledge, and remaining years of the consumed to the consumer. She spoke of it as casually as one might discuss a recipe, Harrington wrote. She explained that Emmanuel had been the first prepared and served to her dying husband in an attempt to prolong his life. When this failed to prevent Jonathan's death, she realized her error. The essence must be consumed by one in perfect health, not already declining. She then turned the practice toward her own benefit. The judge's document went on to describe Abigail's claim that Solomon was not merely a servant, but a willing participant in her rituals, having brought knowledge of similar practices from his homeland. Together, they had refined the process, with Solomon preparing the materials, and Abigail designing the ceremonies that would maximize their effectiveness. When I expressed horror at what she described, Harrington continued, she seemed genuinely puzzled by my reaction. It is merely a more direct form of consumption than you practice daily, she told me. Your cotton is harvested by those whose lives are consumed in your service. Your wealth is built on the diminishment of others. I have simply removed the intermediary steps and made the process more efficient. Most disturbing was Harrington's account of what Abigail told him about the September dinner party. According to her, it had never been her intention merely to shock her guests with the revelation of what they had consumed. Rather, the meal was part of a larger ritual. By consuming what they did, and then learning its nature, the guests became unwitting participants in a process that connected them to Abigail through what she described as bonds of essence. She believes she is drawing life from us, Harrington wrote in his final paragraphs. Each death strengthens her. Each night I feel my vitality diminishing, as if something pulls at me from within. I have written this account with my remaining strength, hoping it may serve as warning, though I fear it is too late for those of us who sat at her table. To any who read this after my passing, beware the widow Thornwood. What she takes, she keeps. The investigation prompted by these revelations continued into 1847, but ultimately produced no definitive conclusions. The unusual deaths were attributed officially to an unidentified contagion, possibly brought to Savannah by foreign vessels. Abigail Thornwood was listed as missing and presumed dead, possibly a victim of misadventure during her journey north. The case might have faded entirely from public memory had it not been for a curious discovery made in Baltimore in 1868. During renovations to a boarding house that catered primarily to sailors and dock workers, construction workers discovered a hidden room containing items that matched descriptions of those taken from the Thornwood mansion when Abigail departed. Among these was a journal written in the same hand as the ledger found in Savannah. This journal, now preserved in the Maryland Historical Society archives, contained entries dated from 1844 to 1867. The writer, who never identified herself by name, but whose handwriting matched Abigail's, described travels throughout the eastern seaboard and eventually into the Caribbean. Each location was associated with descriptions of individuals encountered and then harvested, the term repeatedly used in the journal. An entry from June 1852 written in New Orleans is particularly revealing. The process has been refined to such a degree that I need only establish physical contact and maintain it for several minutes to create the initial bond. Consumption is still necessary for the full effect, but can now be accomplished with much smaller portions. A lock of hair, drops of blood, even nail parings serve adequately when properly prepared. This allows for more discreet operations in populous areas where disappearances might draw unwanted attention. Another entry from April 1861 suggests that the writer had begun to experience unexpected consequences from her practices. The voices of those harvested have become more persistent, no longer fading after the initial absorption. They exist within me now, a chorus that never fully quiets. S suggests this is the natural result of accumulation beyond a certain threshold. If so, it is a price I am willing to pay for continued vitality. I have not aged a day in 18 years, while those around me wither and decay. The final entry, dated January 12, 1867, noted, Solomon has grown concerned about the acceleration. He does not understand that, as the process refines, so too must the frequency increase. We disagreed for the first time today. He threatened exposure. This cannot be permitted. Tomorrow I shall prepare the table for him. No subsequent entries appear in the journal, and no further evidence of Abigail Thornwood's existence has ever been confirmed. Solomon's remains were never found, though items identified as his personal effects were discovered in the Baltimore location, including the intercepted letter from Philadelphia regarding Dr. Blackwood's autopsy results. Also among Solomon's possessions was a small notebook written in a cramped hand, different from Abigail's. This document, partially damaged by water, contained what appeared to be instructions for various preparations, along with cautionary notes. One legible passage read, "The practitioner must exercise restraint. Each essence absorbed carries with it not only vitality, but identity. Over time, these accumulated identities will assert themselves. The boundary between consumer and consumed blurs. Eventually, one becomes a vessel for many, with no single self remaining dominant." The Thornwood mansion in Savannah still stands, though it has passed through many owners over the decades. Residents and visitors have consistently reported unusual phenomena: sudden cold spots, the sound of a woman's laughter when no one is present, and most commonly, inexplicable sensations of hunger that seem to intensify at night. Margaret Wilson, who owned the property from 1902 to 1914, wrote in her memoir, "The house never feels entirely empty, even when one is objectively alone. There is a weight to the silence, a quality of expectation, as if unseen presences wait just beyond the edge of perception. Most disturbing are the dreams that come to those who sleep under its roof, dreams of consumption, of being both devourer and devoured." I would have dismissed such experiences as the product of overactive imagination had they not been reported independently by guests who knew nothing of the house's history. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from those who have dined in the home. Many describe experiencing unusually vivid dreams afterward, in which they find themselves seated at a long table across from a woman whose face remains in shadow. She offers them food from wooden platters, explaining in a soft voice that by accepting her hospitality, they become part of something eternal. In 1923, a visiting professor from Emory University, who spent a night in the house, reported, "I dreamed of a dinner party that seemed to extend infinitely in both directions, the table stretching beyond the limits of the room. At one end sat a woman in widow's weeds, her face obscured by a heavy veil. As I watched, guests around the table began to fade, becoming transparent until only their outlines remained, while the widow grew more substantial with each disappearance. When finally she turned her attention to me, lifting her veil, the face revealed was not a single countenance, but many, features shifting and blending, as if multiple visages were competing for expression through the same skin." In 1964, during the last documented investigation of the property, researchers from a prominent university's parapsychology department recorded unusual activity in the cellar where Abigail's hidden room had been discovered. Sound equipment captured what appeared to be two voices engaged in conversation, though only fragments were intelligible. The clearest phrase, repeated several times throughout the recording, remains unexplained. "The table is set. Will you join us?" Temperature readings taken throughout the investigation showed dramatic and inexplicable fluctuations, particularly in the dining room. Photographic film exposed in various locations throughout the house developed with curious anomalies, areas of exposure that formed what some interpreted as faces superimposed upon the normal images of the rooms. Most striking was a photograph taken in the cellar, which, when developed, showed what appeared to be a table set for dinner in a space that had been empty when the photograph was taken. Dr. Elizabeth Carrington, who led the investigation, noted in her final report, "While maintaining scientific skepticism, I must acknowledge that the Thornwood Mansion presents one of the most compelling cases of residual psychic energy I have encountered in 20 years of research. The consistency of experiences reported by unrelated individuals over more than a century suggests something beyond mere suggestion or the power of local folklore. Whatever occurred in this house in 1843 seems to have left an impression that transcends the normal boundaries of time and physical space. The Thornwood case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of psychological manipulation and possible ritualistic practice ever documented in antebellum Savannah. Whether Abigail was a calculating poisoner who constructed an elaborate psychological framework to torment her victims, or whether she genuinely believed in the rituals she conducted, the impact of her actions devastated some of Savannah's most prominent citizens and created a legacy of fear that persists to this day. Local tour guides often point out the Thornwood Mansion to visitors, though few share the complete story of what transpired there in 1843. Some claim this reticence stems from respect for the victims' descendants, many of whom still reside in the area. Others suggest a more unsettling possibility, that something of Abigail's influence remains active in Savannah, quietly discouraging too close an examination of her practices. Historian Dr. James Montgomery, who attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the Thornwood case in the 1950s, abandoned the project after experiencing what he described as health complications that defied medical explanation. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "I've come to believe that there are some historical events that resist documentation, not through lack of evidence, but through active opposition from forces we do not fully understand. The more deeply I delve into the Thornwood affair, the more I feel something pushing back against my inquiries. For those who have studied the case in depth, one detail remains particularly troubling. The physical descriptions of Abigail Thornwood from 1843 note that she was in her late 20s, with dark hair beginning to show threads of gray at the temples. The journal found in Baltimore, containing entries spanning more than 20 years, includes occasional self-references that suggest the writer experienced no visible aging during this period. A passage dated 1858 reads, "Encountered an acquaintance from Savannah today, a merchant named Henry, who had attended one of my smaller gatherings in early '43. He did not recognize me, though we spoke at some length. He remarked that I reminded him of someone he had once known, but that woman, he said, would be approaching 50 now, while I could not be much above 30. I smiled and agreed that I must simply have one of those faces that strikes familiar chords in strangers." The final piece of evidence connected to the Thornwood case emerged in 1968, when a small wooden box was discovered in the archives of a New Orleans museum. The box, approximately the size of a large book, contained a daguerreotype believed to date from 1866. The image shows a woman whose features bear a striking resemblance to the only known portrait of Abigail Thornwood from 1842. Despite the passage of 24 years, the subject appears unchanged, a woman in her late 20s with dark hair just beginning to show threads of gray at the temples. Written on the back of the daguerreotype, in handwriting consistent with the ledger from Savannah and the journal from Baltimore, is a simple message: the essence endures, the vessel is incidental. The curator who discovered this item reported experiencing unusual dreams in the nights following his examination of the daguerreotype. In these dreams, he found himself seated at a dinner table across from the woman in the image, who offered him food from wooden platters carved with unfamiliar symbols. He declined to catalog or display the photograph, instead returning it to storage with a note advising that it not be handled directly. Within months, he had resigned his position and relocated to the Pacific Northwest, where he reportedly refused all contact with former colleagues. Those who encounter this story often dismiss it as nothing more than a macabre tale from Savannah's rich history of hauntings and strange occurrences. Perhaps that is the most comfortable perspective. Yet every few decades, reports emerge from various locations along the eastern seaboard, Charleston, Richmond, Baltimore, even as far north as Boston, of a hostess whose dinner parties become coveted invitations, whose table offers flavors guests cannot identify, and whose vitality seems to increase as those around her inexplicably decline. The most recent such account came from Charleston in 1968, when 7 members of prominent local families died within weeks of each other after attending a dinner hosted by a widow who had recently arrived from New Orleans. By the time authorities began to notice the pattern, the widow had departed, leaving behind a rented house containing a hidden room lined in copper and a small wooden box that appeared to have had sections cut from its lid. The investigating officer, in a report that was quickly classified and removed from public records, noted, "The similarities to the Thornwood case of 1843 are too numerous to be coincidental. Either we are dealing with someone with detailed knowledge of that historical incident who is deliberately recreating its elements, or we must consider possibilities that rational minds are reluctant to entertain." For those familiar with the Thornwood case, such reports raise disturbing possibilities. If even a fraction of Judge Harrington's final testimony is accurate, then what began in that Savannah mansion in 1843 may continue still. A ritual of consumption that defies both natural law and moral boundaries, carried forward by a woman who discovered that the ultimate luxury is not merely to consume the finest things in life, but to consume life itself. The archival record falls silent after 1968 with no confirmed incidents that can be definitively linked to Abigail Thornwood or her practices. Perhaps she has finally passed beyond the reach of mortal documentation, or perhaps she has simply grown more cautious, more selective in her gatherings, choosing guests whose disappearances will not pattern so obviously as to draw attention. One final note bears mentioning. In 1962, a linguistic scholar researching obscure dialects came across a curious reference in a volume on Caribbean folk practices. The passage described a ritual called manger la vie, literally eating life, in which a practitioner could extend their own existence by consuming symbolic portions of others after establishing mystical connections through shared meals. The scholar noted that the practice was said to have been corrupted from its original form by a pale woman from the north, sometime in the mid-1800s, who removed the symbolic elements and made literal what had once been metaphorical. The scholar attempted to locate additional references to this practice, but found that sources became mysteriously unavailable whenever he approached this particular subject. His research notes end abruptly in mid-sentence, and university records indicate he took an unexpected sabbatical from which he never returned. The next time you receive an invitation to dine with an unfamiliar hostess, perhaps consider what might be served and what price you might unknowingly pay for accepting such hospitality. After all, in the most refined circles, the true cost of dinner is rarely listed on the invitation, and somewhere, perhaps even now, a table is being set, platters arranged, and a small silver bell made ready to summon service when the guests arrive.